Welcome to Old Path and our study through the New Testament book of Hebrews. We make it to the 5th chapter today, and this is something about the book of Hebrews. I probably have mentioned it before. There is usually a place in just about every book that I'll ever teach where all of it is important. It's God's word, but you can almost think, okay, maybe it's like a little bit of a lull in what's being written. You know, things that don't just necessarily grip your attention in quite the same way. The book of Hebrews really is kind of one of those things that once you get from that first verse, it's like you put your foot on the gas and pedal to the metal, and it goes all the way to the end. There's no give in this. It moves from one part to another, and I believe does so incredibly seamlessly. But the importance of the things that are shared here, and it's a lengthy book as New Testament books go. But my goodness, the amount of detail and the amount of importance to this book and the things that are dealt with in subject matter are staggering to me. And so as a Bible teacher, there are those books that you look forward to teaching. And this is certainly at the top of my list of the books that I just look forward to when I get to them. It's been so many years since I've taught Hebrews, because it takes a while to make your way through the rest of the books. There's 26 other books, and if you know about our ministry, we kind of go in a systematic work through them. So, I have to get through all of those other books in order to get back here to Hebrews. I don't skip around. So, with all of that said, it is such a fascinating book, and chapter 5 again picks right up where chapter 4 leaves off, and it's going to draw the parallel, but the radical distinction between Jesus as our high priest versus the earthly version of the high priest. So once again, this is one of those places where clearly this is written to a very much a Jewish audience. There's no question about it. I've tried to point it out, or tried to point it out numerous times before, and the reason that we need to be cognizant of that is the arguments are not necessarily addressed specifically and directly to the church, though the church makes application to them certainly, but the line of argument is not to a Gentile audience. It is very much to a Jewish audience. And yet in this particular part right here, we're going to find out why, though God put it in place, it was always only for a time, and that was the priesthood of man that God used to have as people that would minister between man to God on their behalf. And that's exactly what is said here in this part of the text. And so the church in the Gentile world and the Jewish alike have to recognize what Jesus did in his representation of mankind before God in the way of making offerings. And that's really the context of where we are. He's just spoken about in the end of chapter 4 about Jesus being our high priest, and that tempted in all ways as we are, and yet he did so without sin. The writer there is wanting to say Jesus was able, because of being here on earth and doing what he did, going through life as a human being, but doing so perfectly. No failure, no sin, no anything that was outside of perfection. And that makes him completely unique, but it doesn't mean that he didn't go through the experience of having all of the limitations of a physical human body. And so here the creator of the universe takes on the form of part of his creation. It comes as a man, and he gives himself as an offering. He offers himself as the offering. Now, what the writer of Hebrews wants to do is to move on from that and say, now, since you, the Jewish audience, you know about a high priest, and you know what he is supposed to do. You know his limitations. You know his qualifications. You know what his duties were. And yet in all of those things, those people were still just mortal. And so the writer of Hebrews wants them to understand there is the high priest through Levi, and through the tribe of Levi, and in particular the high priest through the descendants of Aaron, starting at Moses and Aaron. And so they understand all that history. Once again, to a Jewish person, that's a common history for them. They understand it completely. And the argument that is being made by the writer here of Hebrews is saying, you're considering going back to a system wherein it had a high priest who was inferior to the one that God has provided for us in his Son, who has no limitations. There are numerous limitations to the one that's of the tribe of Levi and a descendant of Aaron, and he's going to give those. So again, remember, this is an argument that's written so that the person considering going back to something that God has now moved on from and given us the perfect replacement for it, you're considering going back to something that God doesn't even recognize anymore, and he wants them to understand the limitations of even that priesthood. So again, was there a problem with the priesthood? Well, certainly not. There was a problem with the people who served as the priest, but the principle works perfectly. But it was a foreshadowing of what would happen in the person of Jesus Christ as the perfect high priest, who's able to offer a perfect sacrifice, and it was able to do the work of that mediation once and for all. Now, that's going to be something that's addressed further on in the chapters. So there are a couple of things that are presented here in the way of argument that are going to be picked up later in the book, so I'm not going to jump into them too heavily right here and right now, and that'll all make sense when we get to Jesus and the order after he was assigned as being a priest. So with all of that, the writer here, as far as Hebrews is concerned, makes not just a compelling case, but really kind of it's a locked down argument that he makes. There's really no refuting the things that he says here, and there's really no way to try to argue against it. It's foolproof in his reasoning. And that is very simply this: God provided for us through the law priests, and high priest in particular, who would mediate on behalf of people. And yet the work was never done with them because there was never a perfect sacrifice. There was never a perfect high priest. And so in the person of Jesus, we now have a perfect sacrifice, and we now have a perfect one to offer it for us, who has no boundaries and no limitations. He's God in the flesh. So again, they need to recognize you have what God has provided for us in the person of Jesus as our high priest, or you have that which is the Old Testament that needed a permanent remedy, and it can never provide for you the thing that you desire, and that's to be made right before God. It's an either or. You cannot have both things. So the argument that he wants to, if you're considering going back to that, you need to recognize you will, in the process of doing it, you will jettison the one thing that God has provided in favor of something that God had provided in times past that was only supposed to be pointing the way to the person of Jesus, who would give us that permanent solution. So that part is very, very important. To the Gentile walking into this whole discussion, it's wonderful for us to be able to look at this too and say, Jesus, we understand the idea of what the priesthood was, though it's not our history, but we understand that the priests were put there to go between man and God and be a one who would offer on behalf of mankind. That's just wonderful in that understanding. And then for us, again, as Gentiles, without that common history, the idea that there would be someone who would mediate between man and God, Jesus himself, God in the flesh, is that mediator for us. And he goes before us, presenting us and representing us before God, having made himself the sacrifice. And from then on, even operating now as that person who takes us before the Father. It's really an amazing thing. So there are things here that you can read from a Jewish perspective that make perfect sense. There are some blanks, if you will, of why would that be necessary for the Gentile mentality. We can look at it through the eyes of the Old Testament and a Jewish mentality and say, that's why it was necessary for him to come and do what he did. That's why it was necessary that he would offer himself as a sacrifice and shed his blood, because there was a problem with sin. The high priest was going to offer for the sin of the people, and that was going to be an annual thing at Yom Kippur. It happened every year when they could still actually have sacrifices. They can't do that now. There are no blood sacrifices. There's no temple. There's no operational priesthood. That's not taking place now. For the Christian, Jew or Gentile alike, we are able to say Jesus atoned for the sin of mankind permanently when he offered himself, because he was a perfect sacrifice, and he was the one offering that sacrifice as well, not for himself, but for us. So really amazing, amazing things. And again, this is tall grass theology. This is not some minor league kind of a discussion that's here. This is the meat and potatoes, I mean, really substantive stuff of the scripture that answers some of the most intricate and detailed and important matters of our faith. And so that's the stuff that we're studying today. It's so vital that we understand why was all of this necessary. But we're doing so reading a book that was written by a man to Jewish people saying, please don't do what you're considering doing of going back to something that God no longer recognizes. And he gives all the reasons why. If you do, you abandon the perfect that God has given to you in favor of the inferior that was only supposed to point you to Jesus. You're going to go back to something that still points to him anyway, and yet you will have no fellowship with God in that. It's impossible. You cannot be pleasing to God by your own efforts, and there's no way for you to make sacrifice. Thinking of it in today's terms, to the readers here of Hebrews, that idea that there could still be sacrifice made and all the rest, okay, but simply put, in the modern day, more so than ever, to the Jewish mentality, there's no salvation in that. There's not even a functional priesthood right here, right now, as far as this world is concerned. So who is it that mediates? Who is it that offers offerings? How is there atonement for sin when there's no sacrifice and there are no gifts being offered? So you can see how in our modern day, it takes a step even further from this, because the potential that they could at least offer sacrifices and have a priesthood and all that stuff present at the time. But to the Jewish mentality now, even that has been stripped away, helping us to realize that God didn't abandon them. He gave them something permanent, but there are those who refuse it. And there are also Jewish people who have that history and everything else who have embraced it. So it's important that we understand all of those distinctions, and to me, they're fascinating. So with all of that said, we are at Hebrews chapter 5, and we're going to get through verse 10 today. And once again, this is a methodical, incredibly well-reasoned and thought out series of arguments, and it would mean, again, so much more to the Jewish reader of this, because they understand all of what's being said here. He doesn't need to bring them up to speed on the history. It's common to them. They know it. Christians, if you've been walking with the Lord for a long time, you understand it as well. As Gentiles, if you're a Gentile, you understand it because you understand it in the historic sense, though it's not your history. But you can understand the inner workings of it. So the arguments here, just again, amazing. He starts the chapter by giving some differences, the major differences between Jesus as the high priest and then the men that would serve as high priest from Aaron afterward, and all of their limitations. So we are going to read the first few verses, or the last few verses of chapter 4, which leads us into chapter 5. So having turned there, let's have a word of prayer and we'll jump right in. Father, we thank you so much for your word, and we are so grateful that you give us understanding by your Spirit, and you help us to look into the things that are put here in the text, that we may grow in our knowledge of you and that we may understand greater the importance of the things that we read and why do they matter. And again, for the church, this is for us to make application based on what's here, but to remember, may we be mindful of this all the time, that the arguments made here of why a person should come to faith in this way is written to that Jewish mentality, and help us to understand the distinction between those things. So we give you thanks, and we are just eagerly looking forward to what you will teach us through your word, and we give you thanks in Jesus' name. All right, so in verse 4, starting at verse 14, I'm just going to read it. It doesn't need a lot of commentary, but it really helps us because chapter 5, Jesus is in chapter 4, the close. Chapter 5, let me give you the writer speaking, let me give you the differences when we look at Jesus as opposed to the earthly priests. So look at what he says, chapter 4, verse 14. Seeing then that we have a great high priest, means he's already there, he's already done what he's done. And this is written 2,000 years ago, so even more so now. Seeing that we have a great high priest, speaking of Jesus, he has passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. Not lay hold of it, not go seek it out. It's already there. Let's hold it to ourselves. That's why, again, I believe that these are Jewish believers and are considering going back and abandoning their faith in Jesus for what was something else, going back to the Old Testament. Again, I believe that's important that he says that that we are to hold fast. It means that they already have it as possession. Hold it to yourself, not lay hold of it like learn it for the first time. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weakness, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore come boldly before the throne of grace, or with assurance, confidence, that we may obtain mercy and find grace and help in time of need. So he's the one to who we can go, knowing that he represents us and knowing that he is the one who has made atonement. So Jesus is the perfect of what was the model. Looking forward to a person down the road, all of those men from Aaron on down that served as high priest all had limitations. In the person of Jesus, there are no limits. Nothing prevents him from doing perfectly what he did and accomplishing it once and for all. So here, in the opening parts of chapter 5, he's going to start to go through, here are some differences between Jesus and the earthly priesthood. Look at what he says. Verse 1, for every high priest taken from among men is appointed for men in the things pertaining to God, that he might offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. So this would be what the priest was supposed to do as the high priest. He was taken from among men, in this case, the tribe of Levi, but had to also be a direct descendant of Aaron, who was of the tribe of Levi. So you had your priests and you had your servants, the Levites, and they were the ones that would serve around the temple, and that was their task. That was the tribe from where the priesthood came, and the high priest had to be a direct descendant of Aaron. So it says these were taken from among their brothers, from among their peers, from among their family and their tribe, and they were appointed, and notice what it says here, for men in things pertaining to God. That means they were supposed to be on behalf of mankind, Jewish in this case. I shouldn't say mankind because that gives the impression it's all people. Of the Jewish people, then that man was appointed on their behalf to go before God representing them. So, and he did this pertaining to the things of God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices. Now, people look at this as gifts and sacrifices, they're kind of synonymous, and one is more specific and one is more general. But you could also say that it's the sacrifices would be those things of blood, and the gifts would be other things that were offered up, whether they were grain or oil or wine or other things, the inanimate things. So again, when it came to any of the grain offerings or the drink offerings or the oil or any of those kind of things, they were not going to deal with the matter of sin. They were more thanksgiving kind of offerings, and so gifts. In this case, the sacrifices would be more speaking of those things pertaining to blood, because it was done for the sake of atonement because of the matter of sin. I tend towards that camp of, I believe that that's what's meant by the distinction between gifts and sacrifices. And the sacrifices are for sins. So that idea of sins doesn't pertain to gifts, but rather to sacrifices. And again, some people may disagree with that, but we understand what the high priest did. And ultimately, more so than any other person, when it comes to the matter of atonement for sin, there was that day of atonement, and he would go and offer once a year on behalf of the nation. So again, priests would offer sacrifices for sin throughout the year, but the high priest would be the one who would go into the Holy of Holies that one time a year at Yom Kippur on behalf of the entire nation for sins, those things not done without their knowledge or without them really being aware of their offense. So verse 2, this is the second difference. Now he, this high priest, he can have compassion on those who are ignorant and going astray. Now notice again, we have in the perfect illustration of the high priest, Jesus, when we read in verse 4, we have a high priest who has passed through the heavens, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession. We don't have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weakness, is what verse 15 says of chapter 4. Look at the similarity of verse 2. So he, the earthly high priest, the temporary one, likewise is Jesus, because he's human, in this case, a human who is also prone to sin and failure, Jesus not being that way, but they can both have compassion because they're made of flesh and blood. Yet Jesus is perfect, but he still knows the limitations. He knows the temptations. He knows the difficulties of the human existence. He just never failed as we do. But a very similar thing as far as the high priest here in verse 2. He can have compassion on those who are ignorant and going astray, since he himself is also subject to weakness. Was the high priest a sinless man? Of course he wasn't. And of the good and the great high priests, I shouldn't say great because that can confuse us, of the good and noble, the acceptable high priests that had served through the generations, even those men there were not perfect, but they understood their role and they would have taken it very seriously on behalf of the people, realizing that they had been tasked to do something that is incredibly unique among all of their brothers. That is one person and one person alone who could do that. So, second distinction. Though he can have compassion like Jesus had as well, yet whenever he had to offer offerings for the people and sacrifices, he also needed to do it for himself. That's what we get here in verse 3. But once again, the idea that he could have compassion, he was also subject to weakness. He had the potential to fall and to fail and eventually he was going to, obviously going to have a problem with sin. So he would need to offer as well. That's what we get in verse 3 of these distinctions. This is the third one. Now, because of that, verse 3 says, because of what we just read in that verse 2, he is required as for the people, so also for himself, to offer sacrifices for sins. Remember, he's not mentioning gifts at this point. Because of failure and the matter of sin, now it's only focused on the sacrifices, and the sacrifices would be the innocent for the guilty of the animals. And so before he could offer for the people, he had to also offer for himself, he also being a sinful man. When he comes before the Lord, that acknowledgement and that recognition, he would need to do this. Now here's the distinctions and the differences with Jesus. Could Jesus have compassion on us? Absolutely. Now, where it starts to really break down is at verse 2. Does he have weakness like everybody else? No. That's why he's different. Does he have to offer sins for himself before he could offer himself for the sin of mankind? No. If he had to, then he couldn't have been a sacrifice for man. Now, as much as you can, if you're a Gentile as I am, try to put yourself in the mind of a Jewish person hearing these arguments. And if you believe these things to be true about Jesus, you already know them to be true about the men that are being spoken of here, this is really a very difficult, if not impossible, well, it is theologically, it's an impossible hurdle to get over, that you would go back to a system that is dependent on priests who are just like you are. They just happen to have been appointed because they're of the right bloodline and they're the person that's being tasked for that moment. But they will, like all the rest of the ones who had gone before them, they will simply die of age, and they will be all their lives needing to offer for themselves before they can offer for the rest of the people. So in that, Jesus didn't have to do any of those things. He wasn't prone to weakness. He knew what it was like to be tempted, but he didn't know what it was like to fail as we all do, because he doesn't have that weakness of a broken, fallen nature as we do. So in verse 3, also at the same time, Jesus didn't need to get his own house in order, if you will, and make a sacrifice for their own sin before they could think about offering for someone else. That's what the high priests had to do. Jesus had no such limitations. So, in the fourth of these, in verse 4, now no man takes this honor to himself, but he who is called by God, just as Aaron was. So again, this isn't something that could be purchased. And there were times when in the split of the nation, when it moved between after Solomon, it got split between Rehoboam and Jeroboam. Jeroboam up in the north was allowing people to kind of buy their way into the priesthood. So completely out of order, priests were not to be able to function unless they were of the tribe of Levi. That was the priestly tribe. And no person from outside of Levi had the right to serve in that way of priest, let alone high priest, because it was so evenly narrowly defined even from that, not just to be a Levite, but then a direct descendant of Aaron, or else there's nothing to discuss here. So in this case, that starts the question about, well, wait a minute though. But Jesus is also, though he's able to meet the qualifications as a perfect high priest, the problem is he's from Judah. So how then could Jesus be a high priest from the tribe of Judah? Now that would be an objection that anybody would be able to raise as they're reading this. And the writer here, probably Paul, as I've said, is going to answer that question before it could ever even be raised. He's going to give that. And it's a fascinating answer, and we're not going to stop very much with it because it gets picked up in a lot more detail later on in the book, starting at chapter 7. But it's a fascinating transition that happens after this, because that objection is honestly, that would be a problem that, according to the law, God's never going to contradict himself. Our high priest and a person serving as a priest has to be from Levi, period. There's no way around it. Before Levi, that was the only codified, if you will, priesthood that God ever gave any specifics about how it's supposed to work. And let me just kind of step off for a second and deal with that, because it's going to come up quite a bit. But in case maybe some of you are thinking in your mind, well, what about the modern day priesthood? And we know that in the Orthodox groups, and especially Catholicism, you have an entire top-down priesthood in that. And the high priest in the Jewish sense is kind of more represented by what we would call the Pope today, if you believe that. Now, if you believe that, all of the limitations that the Old Testament priesthood had is also held by this one as well. And so the idea that God would need some brand new priesthood with all of its failings is really not shown in the scripture. And again, from the Old Testament, if you want to know what a priest was like and what they were supposed to do, what the offerings were supposed to be, and all of the ceremonial parts of it, everything that it was necessary in order to be a priest, it was spelled out in vivid detail through the first, basically after the Exodus. When they got into the wilderness, you started to see in Exodus, and then through the next three books, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers, or Numbers and Deuteronomy, I should say. In those three books is where you get all kinds of detail in addition to what you have in Exodus. And so that would tell you, again, where do we know it's supposed to be Levi and then a direct descendant of Aaron, and what are they supposed to do, and what are the offerings, why are the offerings necessary, when are they supposed to be offered, and all of that stuff. The details are just minute in what they were expected to do, and God gave that in writing. In the New Testament sense, we have no such thing. The churches may insist that there's supposed to be a priesthood, yet there's no direction given to us in the scripture in the New Testament as there is in the Old. There's nothing that gives the impression that there is a hierarchy from popes to cardinals to bishops to priests to lay people. You have none of that in the New Testament about roles and responsibilities and who can do what, when, and all the rest. And I know I've said this before, the only thing that you get even remotely close to that is found in 1 Timothy and also in Titus. And really what it says about those people that serves as bishops or elders, deacons, that kind of thing, is really just their qualifications. Who qualifies for that? And what kind of character must they be? But it doesn't say anything about what they're supposed to do. So I don't care how old the order is, whatever group it is that says we have a priesthood and here's what we're supposed to do, that's according to their traditions and that's according to their church, but it's not because they can cite for you chapter and verse. Here's where God said, this is what the bishops are supposed to do. This is what the cardinals are supposed to do. This is what the Pope is supposed to do. Or in the Orthodox, they have other offices and other names. None of that is present in the scripture. It doesn't give you any of those details. So it's important that we understand that. Besides, the idea of needing a modern priesthood doesn't make any sense whatsoever in that all of the administration, if you will, of man needing to represent other men before God is really done by Jesus. We were just told that at the end of chapter 4. So, do I believe that there are people who serve in ministry and in the church? Clearly, that's why Paul would tell Timothy, and he told Titus, "Hey, when you're putting the church together and getting things in the proper order, there is going to be leadership." And there will be those people who are the pastors, the teachers, and that leadership, and then there will be the people who are servants. But yet still they're of this impeccable quality, but there's no top-down monolithic, only one-size-fits-all church. It's just the church is comprised of the people, and there are leadership people that God puts in place, and he equips them and gives them the ability to do what they do. So that's what the scripture teaches. Now again, people can go ahead and argue about that stuff as long as they want to. Good for them, let them argue. So, back to the book of Hebrews in chapter 5. Now, in verse 5, here's something else that he says. Now, this is interesting. Let's do verse 4 real quick. Since we've already done that, I have the other little kind of soapbox thing. Verse 4, no man takes this honor to himself, but he who is called by God, just as Aaron was. So, this was an office that was given by God to be that person who would take that place, succession from generation to generation. There had to be a person serving as high priest, but it was an appointment that starting with Aaron, it's going to come through your line. This is who it will be. And God made sure that there was a successive line. The problem was that the people in that line of succession were not always godly men. That's the problem with any kind of priesthood. I don't care what it is. Old or New Testament, for the people that insist on being priests nowadays, they're just prone to corruption. So looking back at any of those old groups that have had priests, you'll find that it is a history of some pretty vile, wicked people in that position doing vile and wicked things because they're godless men. That was the problem with the Old Testament priesthood. It certainly would be the one if there was a New Testament priesthood. That's why it was really done away with, and this book makes that pretty obvious. So verse 5, so then also Jesus did not glorify himself to become high priest, but it was he who said to him, quoting from Psalm 2, verse 7, you are my son, and today I have begotten you. So what's an interesting thing, and I'll point this out when we get to them, there's a lot of them in the book of Hebrews, but without even maybe paying a lot of attention to it, we should take notice. Whenever a writer of the New Testament goes back to the Old Testament and said, this is what that means that that part of the Old Testament is now off limits to other interpretation. It means very, very simply, what we have here represented already in the argument is that Jesus is the Son of God on behalf of the Father here on earth doing the things that God had sent him to do. And so part of that ministry that he had was to be the great high priest. And it wasn't something that he took to himself. It was given to him by appointment by the Father. And the evidence for that argument that the writer of Hebrews offers is he says, when you read back in Psalm 2, verse 7, this is the Father speaking to the Son before he's born. So it's a prophetic passage. And it's the Father saying, I have begotten you. So you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Now, begotten him is not just the sense of having a son, but this son had a purpose for being born here. So this goes along very nicely with what we read in Isaiah 6 when it talks about, we just finished with the whole Christmas season, but that passage, I think it's around verse 9, where it says, unto us a son is born, unto us rather a child is born, and unto us a son is given, and his name will be called. And you look through that, and all of those titles for this child that's born, this son of the Father, these are it says even at that, the government will be upon his shoulder. And don't think earthly government, think spiritual government, the house of God, the eternal kingdom, it's built upon him. And so because of what he had accomplished, he's the one that is the focus of it. He will be that ruling King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So really important for us to recognize that was the Father tasking, if you will, the Son, that the day would come when he would take on a body of flesh and blood. So the writer here in verse 5 quotes from Psalm 2:7 and said, Jesus was appointed. And if you need evidence for it, go read Psalm 2, verse 7. Now, again, that instant objection. Wait a minute. Jesus can't be a priest. He's not from the tribe of Levi. It's a non-starter. And to that I would have to agree. If Jesus is from the tribe of Judah, which he is, he cannot be a high priest according to the law and according to the way that God had structured the priesthood, that it had to come through Levi, let alone that it needed to come through Aaron. So how does God deal with the fact that Jesus is from the wrong tribe when it comes to the idea of priesthood? Well, he answers that question as well in verse 6. He also says in another place. So what he's doing is combining those two verses. He's taking from Psalm 2, what we just read, "You're my son, today I've begotten you," Psalm 2, and he combines it with Psalm 110, where he says, "You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." Now that's taken from Psalm 110, verse 4. Now, if you want to say, well, who's Melchizedek? If you've never heard of this before, very mysterious guy, and we're going to get into this a lot when we get to chapter 7. We'll go and do a deep dive on Melchizedek as much as we can, but there's kind of limited information. Right now, the writer of Hebrews is not looking to get into that big discussion. It's kind of like, we'll get back to that here in a little bit, but let's take care of this first part first, is kind of the way he's addressing this. So he says he's begotten of the Father to be a priest, but it's according to an order of this man Melchizedek. Genesis 14 is where you read about him, and we are talking about a person who is a contemporary of Abraham. So when I say that, you can think, okay, let me think timeline here. If I'm thinking timeline, if Moses and Aaron are here, then that puts Aaron back, or not Aaron, but that puts Abraham back here, and Melchizedek is here. So that means when you read about this Melchizedek person, and again, chapter 14 or chapter 7 will deal with this a lot, Melchizedek was also referred to as a priest. And he was a priest in a place known as Salem, what we would think of as Jerusalem later on in history. So he was a priest who was in a place of operation at the time of Abraham, and he's seen as a superior to Abraham because Abraham kind of bows to him and offers to him. And so that gets brought up a little bit later in the book as well. But that opens up this whole brand new thing that, again, for anybody that would have an objection, but Jesus is from the tribe of Judah. This is the writer saying, yeah, but he's from a line of priests that predate the giving of the law. They predate Moses. They predate Aaron. This priesthood, of which we know next to nothing about, was in operation. And clearly this Melchizedek is not just some priest like we might think of like Moses' stepfather or Moses' father-in-law. This is more a priesthood that God recognizes because Abraham's name is dropped in it and he interacts with him. So clearly this is something that we just simply don't have much in the way of detail. But the writer of Hebrews saying this to them, they know that man Melchizedek existed. He's just as mysterious to them as he is to us, but nonetheless, because of his interaction with Abraham, he is instantly put into a place of prominence and a place of respect and awe because of how Abraham interacted with him. So again, if you're going to try to make the case, as the writer here does, to a group of people who are thinking about going back to an Old Testament priesthood, the writer of Hebrews would say, well, let me give you something to consider. Jesus is a high priest with no limitations, and the offering that he offered is not just an animal, he offered himself. His blood was pure and acceptable as far as God, so he offered that. Of his own free will, he offered himself, and his blood atones for the sin of mankind. He has no limitations, doesn't need to offer for himself, and he's part of a priesthood that was not temporary. He's part of a priesthood that predated anything that we knew as priests. He goes back to an order that was known by the person Melchizedek. Did it have priests before Melchizedek? Who knows? How long had that priesthood been in operation? We genuinely don't know. But there's a whole lot of the history before the law that they were doing things like burnt offerings, and they were making sacrifices, and they were doing all that. And then there's a priest named Melchizedek, according to that order that he belonged to. Now, was he the originator? Was he the first of the kind? Or were there ones before him? Again, we don't know. But we recognize that God had a way of working with the people, and there was some kind of mediation, there was some kind of offerings that took place. They were doing those things, but we don't have the writings as to why and how and what were the specifics. That's just frankly not given to us. We don't have that detail in the text. We don't get that until God says, let me codify the law. It's going to be put in writing now, and that was done through Moses. So a very, very interesting thing. If this writer of Hebrews wants to say, if your objection is that Jesus is from Judah, let me make sure you understand this, writer of Hebrews to the Hebrews that he's writing. Jesus is of Judah, yet God appointed him, and he appointed him after an order that predated Aaron, Melchizedek. So, problem solved. Jesus can operate as a priest outside of the priesthood of Aaron that was temporary. So you get it? Hopefully you can. Again, I know I go through this stuff and I talk about it as though it's just something that everybody knows. If this is your first time studying through Hebrews, this is like, man, I feel like I'm swimming in detail here. If you are, and if I'm going too fast or I'm not really covering it as thoroughly as you would like, by all means, contact me through the email, and I'll be happy to answer those questions. It's at oldpaththeology.net. The web address will also be given at the end of the video. It's just written out there on the screen. So again, the importance of this, the arguments, any ones that could be brought up, he addresses them beforehand by saying, Jesus is not constrained under the priesthood of Aaron. He's part of a priesthood that God had ordained him to be a part of before Moses or Aaron was even born. There was no written law with that limitation in place as God appointed him towards that or under that priesthood. So, with that being said, now what does it say about this whole thing of Jesus being this priest? It says, who in the days of his flesh, that's speaking of Jesus. Now, how do we know it's speaking of Jesus? If we read on, we'll see. When he, speaking of Jesus, had offered up prayers and supplications with vehement cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and was heard because of his godly fear. Now, this is something that there are a couple of camps, two major camps that I've read on, of what does this mean that he cried out and he was heard about escaping death and all the rest of it. So let me give you both of the versions or the views of it. Now this, again, it's obvious that it's Jesus, who in the days of his flesh, speaking of Jesus, when he was here and he was alive and present among us, when he had offered up prayers and supplications, that took place at Gethsemane. That part is really not much in dispute. So what do we remember about the prayer at Gethsemane? Father, if there's some other way, let this cup pass from me, but nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Let's look at the rest of the letters here, or the words here in verse 7. To him he cried out with tears. Now, all we know is that it says that he sweat, as it were, drops of blood. We don't hear about tears, but the writer of Hebrews here adds that in. It's just that idea of the pressure and the anguish and the difficulty of recognizing what's coming. Now, even in that, when you go back and read the whole narrative of his time at Gethsemane, there are people who would say, well, why was he in such a place of grief and agony and difficulty and trouble? He knew that he'd already said, I'm going to be delivered into the hands of the Gentiles, deliver me to the Jews, I will be put to death, but I'll resurrect on the third day. He already knows the outcome of these things. So it goes a couple of different ways. Why would he then be going through the anguish and the tears and the troubles and all the rest? And why would he be going through all of these things? So the way that question has been answered, his anguish and his trouble and his fear is what's going to happen to those in the throes of all of what's about to happen. All of his disciples are there present with him, the apostles anyway, and whoever else may have been there. They're with him there at the Garden of Gethsemane, and he's actually walked a little further into the garden, and he only takes the three with him, James, John, and Peter. And they're waiting for him. Well, Peter falls asleep, but you get the point. Then he goes on further all by himself, and he goes to pray. So the questions that come up, why is he, if he already knows the outcome, why would he be pouring out his heart and his mind, and why would he be saying all of these things? Is he concerned about the well-being of those who are going to be scattered? Does he think about the trouble that's going to befall them? Though he knows the outcome, they're still really tossed to and fro by the whole thing. I think there's an element of truth to that. And I think that there's also an element of truth to say, though he's God in the flesh and knows what's all going to happen, he realizes from the very human point of view and from what it will end up exacting from him in the physical sense and the torture and the brutalization that he's about to go through, knowing what's coming, I can see where that would be a point of anguish as well, and trouble and difficulty and crying out with fear and everything else. Why else would he say, if there is some other way, let this cup pass from me? Is there another way? Now, of course, he knows the answer to that as well, but he still puts it out there in the way of in a very human sense, I believe, saying this is just almost unimaginable, the kind of suffering that's about to go on here. Nevertheless, he says, not my will, but yours be done. And that's what I think is meant here. This is my belief, as it is other commentators, that it says that he was heard for his prayers. His prayers were, if it can pass, nonetheless, your will be done. Well, we know that God's will was done. His son had to go through all of that, in all of its misery, in all of its humiliation, in all of its grief and pain and unimaginable terror. He had to go through all of that. There are others that would say that idea, let me read verse 7 of the way that they read it, that God was able to save Jesus from death and was heard because of his godly fear. This is more their view, is that, well, Jesus was preserved from having to have seen death in a permanent sense. So he was saved out of that because the resurrection would come. Well, that was to me a foregone conclusion. It's not that Jesus needed to say, don't let me stay in the grave, if I understand their way of looking at it. I don't believe that holds up very well to the text that is here. If we look at Jesus as very much human, he knows what's coming and has to be taking it into account. And in just his way of saying, in that limited place of being human, remember, we got to be reminded, there were some things that he laid aside while he was here. And, everything that we know about him, that he would make even that request, if this cup can pass from me. We look back on it and say there was no way that cup could pass from him, because without him, there is no perfect sacrifice. There's no blood that could be shed that could atone for the sin of mankind if he doesn't. And yet he asks. And God answers his prayer in that you must go through this because it's necessary. So what an amazing thing verse 7 tells us. This Jesus, who in the days of his flesh, when he, Jesus, had offered up prayers and supplication, we have that record in the Garden of Gethsemane, he did so with vehement cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and was heard because of his godly fear. Because he says, nevertheless, not your will be, but not my will, but yours be done. Read what he says also, or what Paul says in the book of Philippians chapter 2, starting at verse 5, about let this mind be in you that was also in him. And so he uses Jesus as the pillar, if you will, of obedience. He, speaking of Jesus, he became obedient even to the point of death, of giving his life. So be like that in your obedience. If you want to say, if God says, I want you to be obedient, okay, how much? Paul would say, be obedient like Jesus was. He withheld nothing. So to the limit, to the extreme, do what you can to be pleasing to God. So in verse 8, and though he was a son, yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. Again, this is a very good take on what is in Philippians 2. And we have a few moments, so let's go ahead and do it. Let's go to Philippians 2. And it's a passage that I'm sure, did I already read it once since we started this? I kind of forget exactly. I know I've made reference to it recently, but we'll take a look at it starting in verse 5 of Philippians chapter 2. It says, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God did not consider it robbery to be made equal with him. It's just a very poetic way of saying, though he was God, he didn't have to remind everybody else of it. He was able to just take that upon himself, and it was self-evident that he was God. He didn't need to announce it. So, verse 7, but instead of Don't you know who I am? Instead, he made himself of no reputation. Doing what? Well, he took on the form of a bondservant, and he came in the likeness of men, which is what Hebrews has been speaking about. The Word became flesh, and he did these things. Again, that's what we get in the very first parts of the book of Hebrews. He came to this earth as the representation, and he delivered the message that God had done through mediators before. Now he's here in person. And so everything that we've read in the book of Hebrews is all about this to this point. He made himself of no reputation, took on the form of a bond servant, and coming in the likeness of men, being found in the appearance as a man, he was among us. He humbled himself and became obedient to the point of even death, even the death of the cross. So again, if you want to know to what extent and how much should we do the things that we're supposed to do, we have the perfect representation of obedience in the person of Jesus. Though he was God in the flesh, did not rebel against what he was sent here to do, but to the Father, he was absolutely obedient, even to the point of laying down his life. And so what did God do about that? Therefore, God the Father also has highly exalted him and given him a name that is above every name. Now, he already had that name, but because of his obedience and what he did in conquering death and perfecting everything he was sent here to do, God has said there's the name of Jesus above all other names. And it says that at his name, the name of Jesus, every knee would bow. Those in heaven, those that are on the earth, and those that are under the earth, and that every tongue would or has to confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of the Father, or in recognition of, sent by the glory of the Father. So, back to the book of Hebrews. Notice how what we read in Philippians is kind of an expansion of what we just read in verse 8. So, though he was a son, yet he learned obedience to the things which he suffered, or through the things that he suffered. So, yeah, he's eternal, he's the creator of all things. And yet he confined himself to a body of flesh and blood because the Father had sent him to do so. Though he was the Son, yet he did these things. And so it tells us he was obedient by the things that he suffered. Everything that was put before him, that's what he did. And I think that's a good commentary on verse 7, what was meant by delivering him from death. Verse 9 says this, and having been perfected, past tense. Now that perfected isn't a commentary on that Jesus was perfected because there was some lack in him. It means that perfected means that he completed the task that he was sent here to do. Now, there was never a question as to whether he would be able to do it. There was never a question of whether he would accomplish what he was sent here to. The perfection came at the completion of those things. It wasn't that, wow, it was really touch and go there for a moment. It was never in doubt. But the perfection came when he completed the task because it was brought to a place of perfection or completeness. There was nothing left to be done. That's what's intended by verse 9. So then Jesus, having been perfected, he then became the author or the originator, the person who first gave life to. He was the one who was the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him, or we might say who believe or have faith in. Now the obedience would be, these are the things that I have taught, these are the things that are put in place, and is a matter of obedience, believe these things, and this is the essence of faith. This is the essence of trust and why we believe what we believe. So he's the author of that. It means that he's the originator. You don't go to some other source, he's the source. So because of him doing what he had been sent here to do, because he's a high priest, because he's according to an order that predates the other priests, he has no such limitations. And through his obedience, God made complete or perfect his work that was sent here to do, which was really the atonement for the sin of mankind, that all who could come to him could be cleansed of their sins and made right before God eternally, and thereby the promises that have been given to us will spend eternity with him. Now all of that is realized. It's now, not only is it possible, it is put in place that all man must do is come into that understanding and that belief in it. So then he's able to say, this same Jesus, circling back to that whole Melchizedek, he is called by God as high priest but again, according to the order of Melchizedek. So it's not as though they didn't know this, because what we're going to get at the close of chapter 5, it really kind of, the context is going to want to lead us more to to chapter 6. And the verses that we have here in front of us, verses 11 through 14, are kind of bridge for me, because it's said in a way of, you guys should know all of this and it shouldn't even be a question with you. Yet it is. And there's a reason why. It's because your spiritual apathy, and it's created an atrophying of your spiritual understanding. And then they goes into some very, very stern cautions in chapter 6. So I'm going to reserve those for next week. But for what we did here today, the importance for us to recognize is that the writer of Hebrews here says there was nothing wrong with the priesthood that God had given to man through Moses and through Aaron and through the law. The problem was it had to, by its very definition, only be temporary, because it never gave a permanent solution, because the person offering the offerings was himself a fallen man, and he sinned just like everybody else. So the offerings were inferior because they were just animals, and the person offering them was also inferior because he was just among men. In the person of Jesus, his offering is perfect, it's not temporary, and he, as being our high priest, has no such limitations of the weakness of sin and needing to make offerings for himself. He had nothing to offer because he had nothing for which he needed to offer. He only offered himself on behalf of someone else. So you and me in that case, the people that he died and shed his blood that he could save humanity to those that would come to him. So with all that said, we'll pick up at verse 11 next week. And again, I know this is some really, really detailed theological, deep stuff. So if there's anything that we've studied in this that you haven't heard before, or it's just kind of new to you, and you'd like some further information on it, then by all means, give me send an email to me, contact us, and I'd love to go over it with you, because I think it's vitally important that we as the church understand this, and that we understand even the arguments that would be made, because perhaps we have people that we know from a Jewish background, and it's not meant to argue with them. Remember, these are put there not as a way of saying you can't do that. It's just consider the difference between Jesus and the things that you know of your history and the limitations that there were as far as the law was concerned and the priesthood is concerned. Jesus is under no such constraints as everyone from Aaron after him was. And so ask him just to say, how do you view the argument that is put here by the writer of Hebrews, if you're a person who believes still in the priesthood of Aaron, though it's been suspended for these 2,000 years? Nonetheless, there are still people who believe that. I just say, well, consider the things that the writer of Hebrews says here, because there are certain limitations that old one has. Even if it could be reinstituted now, it still has the same problems. So very, very interesting and very fascinating as well. So again, if you have any questions, please contact us, and I'd love to answer those. And for the rest of us, we will pick this up next week at verse 11.